On the 15th of June 1941, a Soviet intelligence agent sitting in Tokyo sent a message to Moscow that contained the exact date of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the precise number of divisions that would cross the border, the direction of the main attacks, and the name of the operation. And when that message reached Joseph Stalin's desk, Stalin picked up his pen and wrote across the top of it that the source could be sent to his mother, except that he did not use the word mother. And then he put the message in a drawer and went back to believing what he had already decided was true, which was that none of this was happening, and that anyone who said it was happening was either a fool or a British agent trying to drag the Soviet Union into a war that Stalin had spent 2 years carefully avoiding. 7 days later, 3.5 million Soviet soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. 4,000 Soviet aircraft had been destroyed mostly on the ground without getting airborne, and the most catastrophic military disaster in the history of warfare was underway across a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The man who sent that message from Tokyo spent the next 3 years in a Japanese prison, while Stalin officially denied ever having heard of him, and was hanged on the 7th of November, 1944, the 27th anniversary of the October Revolution, while Stalin said nothing and did nothing and sent no one to save him. What makes this story genuinely unbearable to examine closely is not just that Stalin ignored the warning, although ignoring a warning of that precision and that accuracy is remarkable enough on its own, but that he had been ignoring warnings of essentially the same content for 6 months before that final message arrived, that those warnings had come not just from one source, but from multiple independent sources, including Winston Churchill personally, American intelligence, Soviet border guards, Soviet agents across Europe, and at least one German defector who walked across the border and gave Soviet officers the invasion date and was promptly arrested for spreading provocations, and that Stalin's response to each successive warning was not to update his assessment of the situation, but to become increasingly convinced that the sheer volume of warnings was itself evidence of a British conspiracy to start a war between Germany and the Soviet Union, which was exactly the kind of reasoning that sounds insane from the outside and made complete internal sense to a man who had spent 20 years making reality conform to his preferred version of it, rather than the other way around. Richard Sorge had been working in Tokyo since 1933 undercover as a correspondent for a Frankfurt newspaper, and the cover was so good and so thoroughly maintained that he had become a genuine fixture of Tokyo diplomatic society, a man who attended the right parties and knew the right people, and was trusted by the German ambassador Eugen Ott, with the kind of intimacy that ambassadors reserve for people they have decided are completely safe, which meant that Sorge had access to cables and documents and conversations that passed through the German embassy in Tokyo, and that the German embassy in Tokyo had access to communications from Berlin that described in considerable detail what the German military was planning to do in the summer of 1941. Sorge fed everything he learned back to Moscow through a network of agents that included a Japanese journalist named Hatsumi Ozaki, who had his own access to the highest levels of Japanese government. And the picture that emerged from these two sources combined was so clear and so specific and so consistently accurate that it should have been impossible to dismiss. And yet Stalin dismissed it with a consistency that matched the consistency with which Sorge kept sending it. The warnings began arriving in January 1941, when Sorge reported that German military planning for an Eastern campaign was underway, and that the target was the Soviet Union, and that the timeline was the spring or summer of that year. and Moscow's response was to note the report and do nothing, which was a response that Sorge might have understood if it had been followed by some kind of action at the Soviet border, some increase in readiness, some positioning of reserves, anything that suggested the information was being taken seriously at any level below the man at the top. But there was nothing. So Sorge kept sending, and Moscow kept noting and doing nothing. And the months passed, and the German buildup on the Soviet border continued, and the reports from every source kept saying the same thing in different ways, and Stalin kept writing his annotations and putting the reports in drawers and telling himself that the British were behind all of it, all of what Stalin believed, and what he believed with the absolute conviction of a man who has confused his political analysis with reality, was that Germany would not attack the Soviet Union in 1941 because Germany was not finished with Britain, and that attacking East while Britain remained undefeated in the West was a strategic mistake that even Hitler was not stupid enough to make, and that therefore any intelligence suggesting a German Eastern attack was either fabricated by the British to draw the Soviet Union into the war on Britain's side, or was the product of sources that had been compromised and were being fed false information. And this analysis was not entirely unreasonable as a starting position. The problem being that Stalin maintained it as his conclusion rather than his hypothesis, and filtered every piece of incoming intelligence through it rather than allowing the intelligence to challenge it, which meant that the more accurate the intelligence became, the more suspicious Stalin became of the intelligence, rather than the more alarmed he became about Germany. Churchill's personal warning in April 1941 is perhaps the most extraordinary episode in this entire sequence, because Churchill was not a source Stalin could easily dismiss as incompetent or compromised. Churchill was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who had access to ultra-intelligence derived from breaking German Enigma codes, and who knew with considerable precision what the German military was planning. And Churchill sent Stalin a personal message through the British ambassador describing the German troop movements and the invasion preparations, and urging Stalin to take the threat seriously. And Stalin read this message and concluded that it was exactly what he had always suspected: a British attempt to provoke a Soviet-German war that would relieve the pressure on Britain, and filed it alongside Sorge's reports in the drawer of things that were not happening. It apparently did not occur to Stalin, or occurred to him and was suppressed, that Churchill had every reason not to want the Soviet Union in the war, given that a Soviet-German war would immediately relieve the enormous German military pressure on Britain that had been the defining feature of the conflict for the previous 2 years, which meant that Churchill's warning was actually the opposite of self-interested, which meant that dismissing it as a provocation required ignoring the most basic logic of Britain's strategic position, which Stalin did without apparent difficulty, because by this point, his conviction had become entirely immune to evidence. The Soviet border guards were reporting German aircraft crossing into Soviet airspace on a daily basis in the weeks before the invasion, and these reports were going up through the military chain of command and reaching Stalin's desk, and Stalin was responding by ordering that German aircraft were not to be fired upon under any circumstances, because he did not want to give Germany a pretext for escalation. And the officers who pushed back on this order, the ones who said that allowing a foreign military to conduct reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory without response was not a neutral act, and that the volume of those flights suggested something was being prepared, those officers were told that they were seeing provocations that did not exist, and that they were risking starting a war that Stalin had carefully avoided, and at least some of them were arrested for the insistence. Because by the spring of 1941, telling Stalin something he did not want to hear had become genuinely dangerous, regardless of whether the thing you were telling him was true. The German defector who crossed the border on the night of the 21st of June, 1941, less than 12 hours before the invasion began, and told Soviet border guards that the attack was coming at 3:30 in the morning, was perhaps the most grotesque detail in the entire sequence. A man who risked his life to walk across the border and deliver information of the most immediate and actionable kind possible. And the Soviet officers who received him sent his information up the chain, and it reached Stalin, and Stalin said it was a provocation and a disinformation operation, and went to sleep. And at 3:30 in the morning, the guns opened up along a front of 2,000 kilometers, and the largest military operation in the history of warfare began, and Stalin apparently spent the first several hours of it genuinely uncertain whether this was the real thing or whether it was, somehow, still a provocation by German officers acting without Hitler's authorization. Which tells you something extraordinary about the state of mind of the man who had just been handed the consequences of 6 months of willful blindness. The hours that followed the invasion are documented in enough detail that they form a picture of a man whose entire system of understanding reality had just been demolished simultaneously from every direction. Stalin issuing contradictory orders, Stalin demanding that Soviet forces not cross the German border, even as German forces were advancing dozens of kilometers into Soviet territory, Stalin clinging to the fiction that this might still be unauthorized, and then Stalin simply disappearing, retreating to his dacha at Kuntsevo, and not appearing publicly for several days, which was the most revealing thing he did in those first hours, because a man who disappears when the crisis hits is a man who has nothing left to say, who has run out of ways to make the situation conform to what he believed, and has not yet found a new framework to replace the old one. When members of the Politburo arrived at the Dacha to find him, they apparently expected to be arrested, because arriving at Stalin's Dacha uninvited was the kind of thing that ended careers or lives depending on Stalin's mood. And instead, Stalin looked at them and said that Lenin had left them a great state, and they had lost it, which was the one moment of genuine self-awareness in the entire catastrophe. The one sentence that acknowledged whose decisions had produced this outcome, before Stalin composed himself and spent the rest of the war attributing the disasters of the first weeks to everyone except the man who had spent 6 months ignoring 87 separate warnings that it was coming. Sorge was arrested by Japanese counterintelligence in October 1941, 4 months after the invasion he had predicted with complete accuracy, and when Japan offered to exchange him for Japanese prisoners held by the Soviet Union. Stalin's government officially stated that it did not know who Richard Sorge was, that no such person was connected to Soviet intelligence, and that therefore there was no basis for an exchange, which was a lie of such calculated coldness that it requires a moment to fully appreciate the deliberate abandonment of the man whose warnings Stalin had ignored, left to die in a Japanese prison, because acknowledging him would have required acknowledging the warnings, and acknowledging the warnings would have required acknowledging what Stalin had done with them. Sorge spent 3 years in that prison and was hanged on the 7th of November, 1944, and the Soviet Union said nothing and did nothing, and the man who had been right about everything died in a foreign country, while the government he had served pretended he did not exist. 20 years later, Khrushchev gave Sorge the Hero of the Soviet Union posthumously, which is the kind of honor that tells you everything about the system that gives it, a system that will not protect you when you are alive and useful and right, and will decorate your memory when you are dead, and the man who abandoned you is also dead, and the decoration costs nothing, and changes nothing, and comes too late to matter to anyone except the historical record, which is the only thing that cannot be intimidated into saying what the man at the top prefers to hear.